Nothing better than starting the, oh my gosh, thunderous applause. Stop it, stop it, stop it. So, my father tells me that all the time. I'm Tyler Anderson. I'm Senior VP of Business Development with Precoa. I grew up in my family's funeral homes in Dayton, Ohio. So any of you that grew up in a funeral home, then you know my psychological makeup. We can unpack that later over lunch, maybe. But what we're going to jump into today is really, after hearing Welton, there's a few themes that I think you're going to see pulled through. Now, what Welton's talking about is digital marketing and the way in which you can differentiate yourself and you can offset these two universal challenges that we have as funeral home owners and operators with declining average funeral values and increasing costs of doing business, which we're going to talk about. But as opposed to looking at specifically digital marketing that has more of a focus around brand awareness, generating at-need leads, we're going to have a tilt towards and a lean towards pre-need. So if this is every speaker's worst nightmare, the clicker stops working right when you start. So we're going to identify, which means to learn how families are changing and how to overcome your biggest challenges. Does anybody sense that families are changing, consumer preferences are shifting? If you say no, I'm going to wonder what business you're working in. We're going to then connect with families at the right points on their journey. So every family has a consumer journey as to how they learn about funeral service. More importantly, how they learn about the value of ceremony, ritual, and gathering. And then the last, I don't know why this is as tricky as it is. Okay, maybe I need to stand closer to it. But we're going to increase top line revenue and create phenomenal pre-need experiences. It's just that simple. We're going to get all that accomplished in 55 minutes. Obviously, we're not, but we're going to give you some directional ways in which we can implement, take some things back into the funeral home to implement to do these things. Is there another clicker right here? I'm going to switch it up. Let's see. I did. See if that one will work a little better. Okay. So before we jump in, if you pull out your smartphone, if you can hit this QR code, we're going to have anonymous online or anonymous questions throughout the presentation that can give you real-time polling. If you have a flip phone and you don't have a smartphone, raise your hand so we can all ask you a lot of questions. Publicly shame you. So, or if you can go to the URL slido.com and you can enter in this code and it'll pull it up. So we're just going to go through a few fun questions, kind of get this loosened up so we can see how this works. So how's everyone feeling today? So excited to be here. Fantastic. Could not be better. I've been looking forward to this all day. These answers have a little bit of a biased tilt, but they're very encouraging for a speaker. So, okay, we're going to flip to the next one. Would you rather time travel to the past or to the future? Huh? Yeah, it's the phone. We gotta talk to you more. I really want to know. This is the question you don't want to answer. Is there an alternative option? And fair enough. That's a good answer. If age is only a state of mind, which category best describes your state of mind right now? Cheeky child, tormented teenager. I live with one of those. Groovy grandparent, or mad midlifer. This just gives me an idea of the demographic I'm speaking to. Okay, so we're all kind of getting a feel for how this works. Most overrated. This is the one that people start getting really, this is very polarizing. Chick-fil-A, Chipotle, In-N-Out, or other. Panera also is an option. Panera. Somebody said it was easy. Who said it was easy? What was? They're all it's across the board. Which one were you gonna say? Exp- That's a really good description. That's a great descriptor. Expensive hospital food. That's great. I live in Portland, Oregon, so we're on the West Coast. I think In-N-Out is the most overrated burger spot, but that is a highly polarizing opinion on the West Coast. I almost got sent back to the Midwest. What about this? Are consumer preferences changing? Yes, no, or maybe? Look at that. We have consensus, everybody. We rarely get consensus in anything today. So we all agree consumer preferences are changing. Actually, according to Accenture, 88% of executives say people are changing faster than their businesses can keep up with. That's across multiple industries. So 88% of executives think people are changing faster than their businesses can keep up with. That's a pretty telling statistic. Would you agree with that? As a funeral profession, would you say 9 out of 10 funeral homeowners would say families are changing faster than my business can keep up with? Okay. Here's a telling statistic. U.S. residents 65 and over will be at 95 million in 2060. They'll be at 54.1 million, or they were at 54.1 million in 2019. So by 2034, adults 65 and over will outnumber children under 18 for the first time in U.S. history. So in 2034, which is in 10 years, less than 10 years, Americans age 65 and older will outnumber Americans age 18 and under for the first time in U.S. history. This age band will no longer be comprised primarily by boomers. I want to repeat that because for like a decade, our industry has done nothing but talk about boomers, my opinion. I'm Gen X, so I get a little angry about it. But we spent all this time talking about boomers, and at this point in time, within 10 years, that age band will no longer be comprised primarily of boomers, but of Gen X. And we have spent very little time talking about who Gen X is. We're the generation, like we went from boomers to millennials, and nobody actually recognized there's a generation in between, and this is going to be our consumer. So they're born between 1965 and 1980. They represent 19.3% of the US population, and they're projected to outnumber boomers in less than 4 years. In 2028, 63.9 million Gen X, 62.9 million boomers by 2028. There's a generational shift that's occurring that is not the factor in shifting consumer preferences, but is a contributing factor to shifting consumer preferences. In a few words, describe today's consumer. If you just pull up your smartphone, I have a box in there, just type out a few words as to how you would describe today's consumer. Who are you meeting with in the funeral home? Who's sitting around the arrangement table, whether it's a pre-need arrangement or an at-need arrangement? If the survey came off of your phone, you can just hit the QR code again. It'll come right back up. More educated, fickle, grieving spouses. It's very literal description. Women, tech knowledgeable, skeptical, less religious, educated, knowledgeable about the industry, tech people who know more than you in their eyes, entitled, looking for a cheapish option with little to no hassle, cautious with money, less rooted, penny pincher, unchurched, still older adults with younger family members helping, broke, indifferent to yesterday's ceremonial practices, entitled and cheap, more concerned with cost and experience than quality. That's an interesting one. When we say more concerned with cost and experience than quality, I would associate experience with quality. Expedience. Okay, got you. So that makes sense then. Good clarifier. Angry, transparent. Some of these descriptions of today's consumer, I would say we might be angry. In the way in which the lens in which we view the people we're serving. 74, according to NFDA's most recent survey, 74% choose a funeral home for convenience, location, or reputation. The first two, convenience and location, those are shifting consumer preferences to perceive simplicity, right? What's the location and what's the convenience of using that funeral home? What percent of families today do you think compare prices? 58, 22, 34, 79. Oh, look at that split. Wow. I don't know if I've ever even seen that happen. Okay, I'm going to quit it there because you're right. So 30% had it correct, 58%. So if you think 74% are choosing on convenience, location, reputation, two primaries being convenience and location, and 58% are price shopping, then we are looking at individuals who are defaulting to two data points when making decisions: perceived simplicity and price. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that happens. So when you look at this today, what do you think the two biggest challenges facing our profession are? Not the two, the biggest. I gave away my preview. I'm going to narrow it to two. But what do you think are the biggest challenges? Besides broke consumers. Competition and cost, cremation, staffing, average ticket diluted due to cremation, perceived value of death care, shifting consumer preferences, ourselves and tradition, rising cost, staffing, expenses, consumer evolving faster than funeral home, inflation, simple cremation, inconsistent regulation from state to state. It's a good one. Slow to adapt. When you look at these, just as an industry and as a profession, I think there's 3 or 4 that are internal to us, where we say slow to adapt, anchored to tradition. But when you look at the majority of the answers provided, they're external. Competition, cost, inflation, shifting consumer preferences, things that we have very little control over, but yet we cite those all the time as that's the reasons why my business is struggling. That's the reason why we are challenged. Those are challenges, but that's not the reason why the funeral home business is challenging or the funeral profession is facing headwinds. So when we look internally, I'd encourage you to think through the lens of what are the things that we can do to address these, such as becoming unanchored from tradition, becoming more adaptable, and being quicker to pivot when we're not finding things that are working or finding relevance with today's consumer. This is an oversimplification. It's very similar to the slide that Welton put up in terms of if we narrowed this down to 2 challenges: declining average funeral value, increasing cost of doing business. If average funeral value is decreasing and cost of doing business is going up, you can actually hold market share and have less top-line revenue. So what are the biggest factors contributing to these challenges? Inflation. What do we mean when we say inflation? Meaning the cost of running the business is increasing at a rate faster than previously? So to elaborate on that, the cost of running the business is going up at a rate higher than previously, potentially. The ability to pass that increase onto the consumer is becoming more challenging because the consumer is not finding the same value in it that they previously did. Therefore, they're not accepting the pass-through of inflation to the consumer to sustain margin. Great. Inaction, hesitance to make operational changes, rising utility costs, uncommunicated value. Can somebody be willing to elaborate on uncommunicated value? I didn't know it was you, Ken. I think we got to go on to somebody else.
I think there's some value surrounding fuel service that fuel records by large are very old, and it's hard for them to communicate.
Well, Welton alluded to that. I think you use the language like, I don't mean that you don't need to brag. Yes, you do. You need to sell yourself because what you do is relevant, it's meaningful, it's connective, and it's healing for people in an incredibly difficult time. And it's a unique individual that steps into these roles and takes that responsibility. And I don't think we need to step backward from owning that. I think we should actually lean into it. And so Uncommunicated value, improper pricing of cremation services, fear of stepping out of our boxes, wages versus revenues, inaction, hesitance to make operational changes. These are awesome. Most people would point to this 61.9% cremation rate in 2024. It's expected to go up to 80% by 2035. Whether or not it does or doesn't, it's another question. But we're at 62% in 2024. Most people would say this is the challenge. But I think this is a symptom of the root causes. And so one of the things that we would point to is this: the rise of religious nuns. People use the term before unchurched. So 29% of US adults, those being 18 and older, identify as a religious nun, which means they do not find institutional religion to have an importance in their day-to-day life, any significant importance in their day-to-day life. If this was a religion, it would be the largest religion in America today. Why does this matter to us? And a lot of it is actually powered by what's called religious switching. 18% of these individuals grew up in a religious-based household, and then upon adulthood, began to identify as a religious nun. This matters to us because as a profession, we historically have leaned on religious institutions to inform people as to what do we do when one of us dies. When my grandfather started a funeral home in 1944 in Cincinnati, what they did then was Lutheran, Protestant, Catholic. Here's the service, here's the service, here's the service, right? And that certainly has changed, and we certainly have adapted, and we become more personalized, we become more customized to that family. But at the same time, there's still a whole lot of that happening today. If people go to a funeral service and there's a pastor that stands up with, evangelizes the attendees and inserts name of the deceased because it's very apparent they didn't actually know him, who is that a reflection on? Is it a reflection on that church, or is it a reflection on that funeral home? On that funeral home. We've given up the service to the church. And when people leave there, what do they say? They don't say, I'm not going to go to that church. They say, I don't want a funeral. And so that's why this is critical to step into that void, and maybe a little bit of an elaboration on what Ken was saying on uncommunicated value. So how can we communicate value well before a need? We obviously think pre-need is a venue to do it. It's not the only venue to do it, but it's a venue to do it. And if you look at unaffiliated by age 18 to 49, 40% of individuals in those age bands, 18 to 49, identify as a religious nun. Not a trick question. Are we going to be serving more of these families or less? More. Well, less religious affiliation, more religious nun. Yeah, I didn't word that very well. So, and then another contributing factor, rise of gray divorce. The only age demographic in which divorce is increased since the 1990s is 50 and above. So we blame millennials for a lot, but this isn't one of them. They just don't get married. But just kidding. So when you look at that, so gray divorce rates have increased almost twofold since 1990. So you have an increasing number of individuals who are sitting in the funeral home under emotional distress, who do not identify with a religious institution. Therefore, they're defaulting to, what does this service look like? We haven't informed, educated them in advance. We've given them no communication prior. They're very likely to default to perceived simplicity and price, and they most likely have a fractured family that they're trying to navigate. Do you live in your hometown? Yes, no, kind of. If you say kind of, I'm really interested in understanding that. We got a kind of. Okay, there you go. That's a good kind. That's why we had the third option. That's awesome.
What do you, how do you define hometown?
How would you define hometown?
Where I lived the longest or the most of my life.
Okay, I think that's a fair definition. I think for the purposes of this, we would typically define it as to where I grew up. And that could be multiple places. So that maybe there isn't one, maybe you default to where I spent the majority of my life. My daughter spent the first 9 years of her life in Dayton, Ohio, and she spent the last 6 years of her life in Portland, Oregon. I'm pretty sure when she's 25, she's going to say she's from Portland, for example, even though she was born in Dayton. The point of this, according to the Pew Research Center, 60% of US adults live in a community they do not identify as their hometown. So funeral homes that are fourth, third, fourth, fifth generation who say, I've served this community for X number of years, they will come back to me. Even if I concede that point, I have a lot of concerns about that statement, but even if I just concede that point, the families you have previously served will come back to you. People are moving out and people are moving in. And if 60% of US adults live in a community that is not their hometown, there's a significantly lower likelihood that they have any prior experience with your funeral home and that there's any built-in value or heritage benefit to them coming to you in the future. I'm just going to use myself as an example. When we put some of this data together, it just all fell in place. But I am a Gen X. My parents got divorced after 34 years of marriage at the age of 55 and 54. I do not live in my hometown. And 44% of the people who live in a community they do not identify as their hometown site work as the reason. And I move for work. So I'm your future customer. No, so that, and we got all kinds of baggage. So 30 million US adults will move at least once in the next 12 months. It's a very transient society when you think about 30 million people relocating in the next 12 months. And it's not limited to a younger age demographic who's pursuing career progression. You're looking at 3 million plus adults 65 and over move each year on average. 3 million US adults age 65 and above move annually. It's a significant number of people in that age demographic. This all results in reduced built-in value created through institutions and consumer norms. Institutions being the religious institutions that used to create the value in ceremony, ritual, and gathering for us. And then the built-in value of consumer norms of, I live in this community, this is my community's funeral home. Those individuals who moved into that community do not view it that way. You have to earn the opportunity to serve them because you have not done so in the past. So real world example, 2024, 300 calls. Let's make this fictitious market. It's an independent funeral home, another independent competitor, one corporate competitor, and one guy who just set up a discount business in a strip mall up the street. Pretty competitive marketplace. So to sustain your market share of 300 families served annually, you have an excellent marketing plan. You got a great digital strategy, right, Welton? You have incredible staff. You pay them well, so you've attracted and you retain top talent. They serve families with exemplary care, concern, and a high ethical standard. And so you've done really well over that time to hold that share. So $7,000 average funeral value, which means that this fictitious funeral home is a $2.1 million top line revenue business, right? So over a 5-year period of time, you did all these things and you invested in your facilities. I don't know why. And in 2029, you're at 300 calls. So congratulations, over 5 years, you put your flag in the ground, you marked your share, and you held. Unfortunately, over that 5-year period of time, you did 6,500. Your average funeral value went from 7,000 to 6,500. So now in 2029, your business is a top line $1.95 million business. You lost enterprise value. So you have $150,000 less to operate your business with today, serving the same number of families. And do those families become less work or more work to serve and create an excellent experience for? I would submit more. Over that 5-year period of time, did you have any staff members come to you and say, you know what, I understand the hardship of owning a funeral home and running a business. I'd like you to hold my salary flat. I'd actually prefer to contribute more to my health insurance plan to help you. No, that's not how we're going to retain and attract top talent into our profession. That doesn't happen. The cost of your employee base went up, the cost of running your facilities, the cost of maintaining relevance in those facilities and making them modern and relevant to the consumer all went up. And this is a good story. You held share. The only way I know, well, I'll try not to sound too biased. The only way I know how to address these two challenges is to take that number of 300 to 330, to 340, to 350, etc. And to do everything I can to hold 7,000 in terms of the experiences I provide and how I inform and educate families to ceremony, ritual, and gathering, and the value of it to them well before the need. The most meaningful innovations come from solving the right problems at the right times in the customer's journey. Just going to give you 2 quick examples. Actually, there's like 4 or 5 examples. So the strategic inflection point, this is a term coined by Andy Gove, the former CEO of Intel. Every industry faces inflection points at different points in time. They can happen back-to-back years. They could not happen for decades at a time. They can be external reasons, such as government regulation changes. They could be a pandemic. Any changes in any industries post-pandemic that we've seen, that would be a strategic inflection point. Or, and most often, they are driven by a shifting consumer preference. So, like, for example, does anybody remember Hummer dealerships? Right? See those anymore? Remember Prius at the same time? Gas mileage, cost effective, efficiency. What was the highest margin vehicle that GM had, do you think? Hummer. What do you think they tried to push to the consumer? Hummer. What was the consumer preference? Prius. They're still trying because now we got electric Hummers. But anyway, aside from that. So when was the last time you took a taxi, a yellow cab taxi? Saw the look on your face. I think it might be never. So I can't remember the last time, in the last month, the last 3 months, 6 months, last year. So right now, the vast majority of people in the room can't remember the last time they took a yellow taxi. If I would have asked that question a decade ago, that'd be obviously a very different reason. Nobody's going to be surprised where I'm going with this. Strategic inflection point when you're looking at yellow cabs, Uber, and Lyft. You know, most people would point to the emergent technology that created a strategic inflection point. I would submit that the technology platform, the emergent technology platform, enabled delivering on the consumer preference. Because I've never heard somebody say, you know what? I really loved standing on the corner of the street in weather. I really loved having to hail a cab and see which one did or didn't have the light on. And I loved risking my life to do it. And the best part of it was when I got shoved in the back of the cab and I felt like I was in a police cruiser and nobody spoke to me for the 15 minutes I was in the car. And I really loved it when they were eating. That was an incredible consumer experience. But when Uber started, what was it? Black cars, right? Lincoln Town cars, bottle of water. And the people were so incredibly friendly that you felt you had your own personal tour guide if you were visiting a city. It's a very different consumer experience. And yes, the convenience of tapping on your phone and having a car show up changed the game, but it wasn't the technology that did that. It was the technology that enabled the consumer preference to be served. When was the last time you watched a movie? This past weekend, the last week, last couple weeks? Just anywhere, on TV, streamed one, just watched a movie. I need to be quicker with that clarification. I get that question every time. This past weekend, in the last couple weeks, in the last month. So 80% of us have watched a movie through some format in the last month. It's a pretty high percentage. When was the last time you rented a DVD? That comes up sometimes. This is last week, last month, last year. What's a DVD? So the idea here, obviously with Blockbuster and Netflix. Now, if I came to you and I said, I got this revolutionary, incredibly innovative idea, I'm going to mail you 2 DVDs. You can watch them for as long as you want. And when you're done with them, you mail them back to me, U.S. Postal Service, of course. And then I'm going to mail you the next 2 in your queue. Would you say that's an incredibly innovative idea? Not today, right? Right, not today. So Netflix didn't just disrupt the traditional bricks and mortar video rental business. They disrupt themselves. And we also have a lot of bias in our own consumer research. So Blockbuster's consumer research told them that the bricks and mortar video rental business was not at risk. for a few reasons. The consumer enjoyed the tactile experience of holding the DVD case and reading the movie summary on the back. They enjoyed the opportunity to purchase snacks upon checking out, and the serendipitous nature of potentially running into their neighbor on a Friday evening. Bullshit. They just wanted to push a button and watch a movie. But we do consumer research in ways that confirms our bias, to gets us anchored back into tradition, right? Because that was true at one time when there was no alternative. And when there was an alternative, they went back and said, no, this is still what people want. And they weren't really asking the right questions because their own internal consumer research was biased towards confirming what they wanted to do. So mailing DVDs, that was the innovation. Then what was the innovation? Streaming, right? Then they doubled down on streaming. They had all these warehouses of DVDs that they were willing to disrupt, dismantle, and throw away to double down on the investment in streaming. And then they disrupted streaming. What was after streaming? This is what a lot of people...
Cable show. I mean, Netflix is...
Content, right? Orange is the New Black, House of Cards. Anybody remember the first time they saw House of Cards or heard about it and they said, who made this? And they said Netflix, and your first response was probably, Netflix doesn't make shows. Now who makes content?
And
Apple, Amazon, Netflix, right? So it's this continual desire to disrupt themselves that has kept them from being disrupted by others. Does anybody still have one of these? Go ahead, feel free, raise your hand. You can give us a sound rationale, because that's amazing.
We're probably the outliers, but we're kind of sick of streaming because it's becoming cable and want to go back to collecting.
This is great. It's like the record collection, though, right? It's like there's something about a record collection that you can't replace, and maybe we'll see it swing back to that way. I point out to this not because of the underlying technology of the cable box, but because of the horrible consumer experience. Most people still have a cable box because they said, "Oh my gosh, I can't even imagine trying to get rid of it." Or is it the 7-day window of time they give you in which they'll come to service the cable box? That great consumer experience, or waiting on the phone for 9 hours until somebody answers, or the $384 you pay a month for 250 channels that you don't want. All of those things are why unbundling happened, right? It was the consumer preference shifted. I want personalization. I want customization. I want relevant content. I want it on demand, and I don't want to pay for the things that I don't want. And so now, is this actually any cheaper? Right? Especially post-pandemic, unless you're incredibly disciplined, which some of us are. I'm not one of them. My subscriptions and what I buy on Apple TV, I'm at a very similar price point as to what I was on the cable box. So it was not the price point that drove the shift. It was the value that the consumer placed in the experience. So your answer should always begin with, what if? Anybody been to Disney World, Disneyland, either one? Yeah. So if we think about what were park attendees most upset about in the 1950s and the early 1960s about Disney World, Disneyland. Yeah. Disneyland. Ticket prices, ride lines, stroller availability, food prices. I guess if I said today, we'd all probably say food prices, right?
Ticket price.
Ticket price, yeah. Well, you can get that super express pass for $1,000, so that's no problem. That's easy. It's only good for 2 hours, but so ride lines. You're exactly right. So the question was, what if the line became a part of the ride? In 1964, they instituted switchbacks. Prior to that, it was just all straight lines. And what those straight lines did is they went into the park, they interrupted the flow of people walking through the park, and all you did was look at the back of someone's head. And when you did switchbacks, you're in the most joyous place in the world. Everybody's so happy, right? So now you have switchbacks where you're people watching, you're interacting with others who are at the park as you're walking through the line. And that was the first simple innovation with switchbacks. The next innovation was actually making the line part of the ride, where they made that experiential itself. Because today you can't go to the park and go to a ride without being in an experience for the hour and 45 minutes you're waiting, to make you forget that you're waiting an hour and 45 minutes for a 3-minute ride. So that was the innovation. What about for Apple? What is the most successful Apple innovation? iTunes, iPad, iPhone, Apple Watch, Apple TV Plus. iPhone. That's a pretty good answer. I didn't really give the one that we would point to as an example. It became a retailer. Their distribution of their product was through big box stores originally. And the big box stores did not represent the experience that their products provided the consumer. And therefore, they're having all kinds of challenges with people purchasing the product in the way it was represented to the consumer. And therefore, they got into the retail business to begin to distribute their own product. And if you go to any mall, indoor or outdoor, what does this store look like compared to others? Open, crowded, people, right? The Genius Bar, all these innovations within the store that made that retail experience significantly better and made that experience reflective of the product that they sell. So I use these examples as not because like at the funeral home, you're going to create the Apple store, not because you're going to put switchback lines at visitations, but you could, and it might not be as joyous as Disneyland. But the idea is like they started the question with what if? And so there was a consumer issue where they were having a headwind in what that experience was. And they sat around and they said, what if this? And that's the idea of what we would encourage us to do within the funeral home, is looking at these situations and these experiences that everybody who walks through those doors, who experiences our service, like what are those pain points and what if? So we truly believe funeral service has the power to change people's lives, and it's up to us to share why. And this goes to how are we communicating the value of ceremony, ritual, and gathering long before someone needs our services? Because if we are waiting until the 24 hours after someone has died to communicate the value of ceremony, ritual, and gathering, and somebody's sitting in that need arrangement saying, I don't want anything, it is incredibly hard for the best funeral director to inform and educate to why they want a service and not sound self-interested. Some can do it. It's really, really difficult. But if you're having that conversation 15 years before somebody's actually passed away, that's a totally different conversation. So if we can speak to families when they're ready to listen, and we're talking about quality pre-need, high quality pre-need, and we want to innovate on lead generation. So we're going to generate high quality leads. Did you think I put up a 19-question, two-sided black and white survey as the first innovation within lead generation? So we talked about this earlier. Welton was right. Direct mail response rates are challenged. Most of the time when funeral homes tell me direct mail doesn't work, I agree with them. The way they do it doesn't work. But that's not the way I would do it. And so when you think about how you innovate around direct mail, it's not the piece. The piece on 19 questions, one, it should be scientific. It should lead them to be a higher qualified lead, and it should lead to a higher likelihood that they convert to an appointment, and you should be able to measure that. Outside of that, if you do not have consumer profiles built on the individuals that have the highest propensity to respond to this piece, then yes, you're going to have a lower response rate. We send out 1.5 million pieces a month on behalf of our partners, and it's the same piece. We record the answers to all 19 questions of that survey. Therefore, we built consumer profiles so we know what those individuals look like in the zip codes that our partners serve. And we can super serve those consumers with this piece. We do proportionate mailing. So as far as an innovation around how you do it, how you execute, most mail plans would lead with, here's the highest market share zip code, and we're going to mail into that zip code for you. That mail plan is going to last 90 days. And then we're going to go to the next zip code, and the number of mailable households that you are relevant to decline over the course of that year in that campaign. And then we wonder why the lead flow slims down, as opposed to doing proportionate mailing, where you look at the entire market and you do that percentage of pieces. And so you hit your entire market every month, and therefore you have a sustainable lead flow. Those are two of many ways in which you can innovate within direct mail. And it's not the piece definitely matters, the creative matters, but that's just tactical on how you actually mail to grow and sustain the response rate. Or if you are doing direct mail into low market share zip codes, you're not going to get a response. I want to repeat that. If you have low market share and you are doing direct mail into low market share zip codes, you will not get a response. It's a bad spend on that tactic. Direct mail works in your highest market share zip codes. We would submit 25% and above because the brand recognition drives the response rate. You want to do other tactics in the zip codes where you have lower market share because, of course, you want to grow that market share, but direct mail is not the way to do it. So you want to strengthen the market share where you're already strong with a tactic like this because it is the most expensive tactic. And if you can't convert on direct mail, it's a bad spin. This is a very intricate slide. See the QR code come up? Another innovation. But QR codes have become ubiquitous, right? So everybody knows, we call this ARMs. We're really good at acronyms. It's an alternative response mechanism. And this goes to the omni-channel approach, right? We reach the consumer offline, and then we give them an online opportunity to respond. So they can hit the QR code and they can actually answer the questions, submit the survey, and schedule an appointment. Or they could just request a follow-up. They can request their final wishes organizer, but they could do that on their mobile device, even though we got them through traditional paper, right in their mailbox. We can text directly, so they could text directly in the response. So they text a number, they'll actually engage with an individual in our funeral planning center and begin the conversation right there off of, again, a piece of paper. So these alternative response mechanisms, as opposed to saying one thing doesn't work and one thing does work, it's always going to be a combination of the tactics. And in addition to that, looking at all the different ways in which you want to get to the consumer, direct mail is one of those. But so is community education programs. We call advertising traditional. So Wine and Peace of Mind, movie event with Indiana Jones. That age demographic loves Harrison Ford. This is a testimonial. You hear this common reason why I wanted to take care of this. I didn't want to be a burden. So consumer testimonials that affirm the thinking and the decision-making of, I think I want to take care of this. And then cremation. These are all three different cremation ads that will be served to the same consumer over a certain cadence because everybody's going to respond to a different creative at a different point in time. And then up here is, again, personal testimonials. So offline, online, different creative in the ways in which you reach the consumer with different messaging. Now, your ability to test is incredibly important. So just to use this example on a double-sided and single-sided. This is a double-sided 19-question black and white survey. This is a single-sided 11-question direct mail survey. And the theory was the 11 question will have a higher response rate. Fewer questions, less laborious, higher reply rate. Which one do you think had a better return rate, single or double? Oh, we're split. So 60-40 single will give you the win. Single-sided had a higher response rate. The challenge is typically what we talk about, we intermix marketing and lead generation as though they're the same thing. This had a higher response rate, which means top of the funnel, more people replied. But there's a significant amount of work that happens in that funnel as to what converts to an appointment. And what we found was that returns aren't results. Oftentimes, if a marketing organization just speaks about the response rate, that's important. It's an important piece, but what happens after the response rate? So a double-sided, we had more appointments set from fewer responses. So when you look at the net number of appointments, they were higher on the double-sided than what they were on a higher response rate on the single-sided. Now, why that would be is 19 questions, higher qualified lead. They're more committed when they send in the response because they went through all 19 questions as opposed to 11. And they had a higher expectation of the phone call to set the appointment. So fewer responses, more appointments. You have to have that type of vigilance within your testing to know what's actually creating a return, because if you're going to make a marketing spend on lead generation, got to know what the outcomes are, well beyond just what the macro of the response rate is. This is more of an innovative approach. I wanted to share it. Didn't work. Hasn't worked yet. I should say hasn't worked yet. I want to have a growth mindset. It's connected TV. So looking at Apple TV, Roku, Fire Stick, you can get on connected TV at a much more affordable price point than you can traditional cable. Through our mail list generation, we can identify the homes that are on connected TV that are going to receive this mail piece. We can serve this ad within 7 days of that piece arriving to the home, and within 7 days after that piece arriving to the home to remind them to respond. Kind of creepy, right? Now it feels very personalized. And just so you know, it doesn't say, you'll be receiving this piece in the next 7 days. But it talks about the funeral home and their desire to learn more about their community. And you may receive this survey. We'd encourage you to send it back in. It helps us understand the needs and wants of the families in our communities. It has not created an uptick in response rate to date. But this is the type of innovation we believe we need in the space to sustain and grow and get to families well in advance, because what we're talking about, an uncommunicated value, is all we're doing is trying to find as many opportunities as possible to have a conversation about why a funeral matters to those left behind. And in pre-need, we've historically said the value proposition is you get to plan the funeral you want. And you look at me and you say, I'm not going to be there. I don't care. And I'm like, well, don't you love your family? Like, that's not going to go very well. And I'm going to guilt you into it. As opposed to, you have the opportunity to put an intentional plan in place that's going to help those left behind take the first meaningful step towards healing. That's a different conversation than you plan the funeral you want. We want to have as many conversations like that as possible, and that's what all this innovative lead generation is about. What we often overlook is in funeral home marketing. We talk a lot about getting outside the four walls of the funeral home. When you have hundreds, I was like, am I already getting kicked off? You have so many people who come through your doors who experience your service every day. They're impacted by loss. They have the highest likelihood to be responsive to prearrangement because they're thinking about their own mortality, because they're in it in the moment. And they're in the funeral home. Now, we don't want to be in their face about pre-need. That's not the time, the place. That's invasive. It's not appropriate. But having these marketing pieces within the funeral home with QR codes that you can hit to learn more about pre-planning or to attend a community education program that's already scheduled, these are opportunities to be in front of families that are already experiencing your exemplary service and who have a high likelihood of wanting to learn more about how to take care of it. Has anybody ever been at a visitation when somebody said to the funeral director, I've been thinking about this, I really need to take care of it? And the funeral director puts a pamphlet in their hand and sends them out the door and says, call me when you're ready?
They're ready.
They just told you. You know how hard it is to ask a funeral director about prearranging and facing my own mortality, and then we give them a brochure and send them out the door. And so those are, and I'm not submitting everybody does that, but I'm submitting that we become much more proactive in capturing the green light moments that families give us when they're inside the four walls of the funeral home. Now, if we generate the lead, we have to have a systematic approach to follow up that we can measure. Otherwise, the worst thing we can do is somebody raise their hand and say, I want to learn more, and then we don't actually do anything with it. That's a disservice to the family that said, I'd like to know more. I'd like to have you help me take care of this. So however you do your follow-up, I'll speak to how we do it, but you have the lead here. You can tell it's a Facebook ad. It's linked to the specific ad. And then there's the content for what the messaging was, the name of the ad, and then the information they submitted. And that's what transfers to the individual who's setting the appointment for the advanced funeral planner. Goes into the mobile app. They can see all that information upon calling. They call and set. It goes to the calendar for the advanced funeral planner. They see all the relevant notes from the conversations that were had through the progression to appointment. And then the day of the appointment, it's in the Procel mobile app, and then you can route right to the appointment. But if you don't have that type of pipeline where it's integrated, where you can measure that all the way through, then it's really, really difficult to understand what the contact rate is for the lead, what the set rate is, and what the hold rate is, and what the presentation rate is.
Or the cancellation.
Hold rate. Exactly right. Same thing. hold means the percent of families that held the appointment they set. So it would be the inverse of cancel rate. And an appointment confirmation. So this is an example of a confirmation email. Hello, Smith family. It is a pleasure speaking with you today. Your appointment on October 15th has been set. You'll be meeting with Tammy Hopper. I think you will appreciate their kindness and expert guidance. Sincerely, Jesse T. And then you got the appointment details right here. And then right here, you say, what can I expect from my appointment? And the 3 main points of what they can expect from their appointment, and a reiteration of the value proposition of pre-need. Every other business does this. When you set an appointment, right? You get a confirmation. And the other key part here is there's a picture of Tammy up there, so they know who they're meeting with. Welton spoke to that earlier in terms of when you're looking at the bios, a picture, it's warm, you know who you're going to see, nothing unexpected. This has increased our hold rate by 3% just by implementing the confirmation email that goes out immediately after the appointment's set. The other thing it does is it allows us to capture the email so that we can communicate with them in the future in the event that they do cancel. If we had an advertised community education program where we had the RSVP, they no-showed it, and then our ability to nurture, so I can talk about nurture campaign in a second, but then to eventually set that appointment, because just because they didn't show at the event doesn't mean that they don't still have interest. And so our ability to serve them with a nurturing email that's personalized, it's white branded to the funeral home, it's caring and empathetic, it's a new offer for the final wishes organizer or whatever that premium giveaway is, clear call to action in terms of click a button, claim my organizer, and then again, signed off with a personalized picture of the individual who sent it. And then general nurturing. It has branded communication, carrying an empathetic message, and then a clear call to action and a new offer to re-engage leads. Because individuals who raised their hands but didn't set an appointment have still expressed interest. And there's really passive ways to nurture them along where they'll have an opportunity to opt in. Have you ever wanted, like as a consumer, raise your hand for something, then decided, now's not the time, went into whatever else. But then because you kept getting this passive nurtured message, at one point in time, you're like, I do need to do that. That's the idea. It's not to be invasive. It's not to ping people every day, but it is to stay in front of them and ensure that they know how much we care about getting them what they've asked for. And then from an experience standpoint, we'll hit this pretty quick. Anybody ever remember something like this? This is the old, if there had been a death in your family yesterday, what would you be doing today? The phone's off the hook. She's staring outside the window. It's raining. You probably can't see it. The picture's a little clear. So we're going to put you in the emotional state of just having lost a loved one, and then we're going to guilt you into doing this today. What a horrible experience. And then if that doesn't work, we're going to overwhelm you and tell you, did you know there's 75 decisions to make within 24 hours of losing a loved one? I didn't, but it doesn't motivate me to do it today. It actually makes me run. And so we used to use these things of, that's weird. It's a great slide.
Very white.
Very white. That should say grief, fear, and guilt. We want to put you in grief. We want to create some fear and overwhelming about the decisions that have to be made, and then ultimately guilt you about, don't you love your loved ones? Don't you want to give them this lasting gift? As opposed to connection, empathy, and education. We could spend a whole day on the presentation methodology around connection, empathy, and education. We don't have the time to do that. But that pre-arrangement experience, if we're going to do all this marketing, we're going to do this systematic follow-up that has measurement to it, and we're not going to have this type of experience, and we're going to miss the boat, because everything up here was just to have this exemplary experience where we informed and educated a ceremony, ritual, and gathering, and what it can mean for those left behind. And why that can really have an impact on pre-need. Let's just say a 400 call funeral home does, a funeral director does 125 at-need calls, right? A pretty decent workload. I'm sure we could debate how many funerals an at-need director should do. For this example, 125. That's really time intensive, right? That's days with each family. It's a ton of work. I'm not submitting that one is more important than the other. But if you had a 40% close rate, a 40% pre-need at-need ratio, meaning you pre-arranged and pre-funded 160 families for every 400 at-need families served, that means that your pre-need advanced funeral planner met with 160, pre-arranged and pre-funded 160 families. Our average conversion rate is 40%. So that means that the advanced funeral planner would have had to meet with 400 families to pre-fund 160. I'm only sharing that not as to one is, again, more important or less important, but for scale. These individuals, 60% of US adults live in a hometown they don't, or in a community they don't identify as their hometown. This very well could be their first experience with your funeral home. That's why it's so critical that that experience is such a good one when you actually get eyeball to eyeball with them. And it takes a significant amount of work and investment just to get there. So I'll hit this really quick, and then I know we got to run. So this is a pipeline metric. This is what we talk about in terms of your ability to measure every campaign, every tactic, online or offline. What's your contact rate? That's the percentage of respondents you contacted. So however many people raised their hand on a campaign, what percentage did you contact, have a conversation with? What percentage set an appointment? What percentage held that appointment? What percentage of those appointments went to full presentation? And of those, what percent funded? These are our company averages. They can look very different from funeral home to funeral home. So if you did a 50,000 piece direct mail campaign, and you had a 2% response rate, that's 1,000 respondents. You're going to have 850 conversations about your funeral home. You're going to set 298 appointments. 209 of those will hold. Of the 80 that didn't, a percentage of those will reschedule, a percentage will just no-show cancel. 157 will go to full presentation, and 63 will fund. Now, if you had a $7,000 funeral average, that's $441,000 in future revenue secured for the funeral home. You can do the math on whatever the average funeral value would be. The investment on that's going to be $25,000 to $30,000. It's a big investment. But if you're able to measure it this way, you can truly tell what the ROI on it is and if it will pay off. So this tech ecosystem, I'm going to hit it really quick. Quick thought as we look at the funeral home of the future. When we moved to Portland, I came home one day and on the front porch, there were boxes from Target. I felt like that happened for about 6 months. But I called my wife. She wasn't home, just see what she was doing. And she said, I'm at Target. I said, well, there's all these boxes on the front porch. And she said, well, those are things that I know I need and I just order online. There's things I need to go see as to which ones I want in the store. And what that speaks to is a traditional bricks and mortar are not going away. They just have to be relevant to the consumer. E-commerce, in terms of the online shopping experience, if you treat the online consumer the same way you treat somebody who walked through the front doors of your funeral home, what happens in most funeral homes when somebody walks in? We jump to attention. We want to make sure they know where they're at, they feel comfortable, what are they looking for? We're going to super serve them in person. Submit online should be the exact same experience, right? They should have that same sense of service and what the quality of that funeral home is. And that shopping experience should be very similar. So multi-channel, you have your person-to-person. What is the experience when they call in to the funeral home? What is the experience when they walk into the funeral home? And then what is the experience when they see your business online? That's multi-channel, and they should all be consistent. And then this omni-channel is the integrated, seamless experience across all devices and touch points. So what we want to do is have an experience where we can find somebody through a targeted Facebook ad. They can schedule an appointment online. That could start with a phone consultation that leads to an in-person appointment. They could come into the funeral home and have that in-person appointment. They could have some things they need to consider before making a final funding decision. And then when they go back home, they could actually just fund it through Apple Pay. And you think about that consumer journey from what it was to what we want it to be. It used to be, I saw an ad, I called in, I set an appointment, I drove in, I was in person. We found this consumer at very different points along their journey and where they were at and how we nurtured them to the funeral home. So with that, I'm going to wrap up on this Brene Brown quote from Braving the Wilderness. It's not a funeral book, but it had this quote about funerals that has always stuck out to me. And growing up in a funeral home, I just thought it summed it up really well. Funerals matter. Showing up to them matters, and funerals matter not just to the people grieving, but to everyone who is there. The collective pain and sometimes joy we experience when gathering in any way to celebrate the end of a life is perhaps one of the most powerful experiences of inextricable connection. I think that really sums up what we get the opportunity to do each and every day for people. I want to give a big thank you to all of you who work in this space. It's a special space. It's a special thing we all get the opportunity to do, and it's not easy. So thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege to be with you.